The story of the first American settlers is not a tale of comfort, but of quiet endurance. Imagine arriving on distant shores after weeks at sea, the wind still clinging to your clothes, the sound of waves fading behind you, and before you a land so vast and untamed that every step feels both promising and dangerous. The forests stretch endlessly, filled with sounds you cannot name. The winters ahead are unknown. The soil is unfamiliar, and every tool you carry is more precious than gold. Into this silence, the settlers stepped, bringing with them only their hands, their will, and their hope for a future they could not yet see. Daily life for these men and women was shaped not by grand events, but by the smallest acts of survival. Each morning began with the struggle to light a fire, to warm stiff limbs against the chill of dawn, to gather water from a nearby stream, to bake bread from what little flour remained. Children awoke on hard bedding, hearing the steady rhythm of axes cutting wood, their fathers preparing timber for shelters that barely held back the cold. Women tended to cooking pots that steamed with thin broth, while also repairing clothes worn by endless work. Every moment was marked by effort, for in this new world, idleness meant hunger, and hunger meant the risk of death. And yet, within this hardship, there was also resilience. The settlers learned to carve their homes out of trees, to shape fields from tangled earth, to find food where at first they saw only wilderness. They created communities, not with ease, but with determination. Around fires that smoked more than they burned, they shared stories of the homes they had left, clinging to memory while shaping a life that was entirely new. Each day was both burden and beginning, a test of endurance, but also a quiet act of hope. This is the story we will walk through together. Not a tale of battles or politics, but of daily rhythms. Waking in wooden cabins, eating meals that barely satisfied, working from dawn to dusk, and finding rare moments of rest beneath unfamiliar stars. It is a story of ordinary survival, of how people endured when the world around them seemed endless and uncertain. Let us step softly into their days. As you listen, let the noise of your own world fade away. Imagine the creak of wooden floors, the smell of smoke in the air, the chill of morning wind slipping through the cracks of a cabin wall. These are the sounds and sensations that shaped the first American settlers. And as we journey through their lives, if you find calm in these forgotten rhythms, remember to like and subscribe, so more of these stories can find you again. Now let us begin. The first light of dawn crept slowly through the cracks of wooden walls, thin beams slipping between rough-hewn logs that had been stacked one over the other, sealed with clay and moss. The cabin, though built with strength, was still young, its timbers fresh, its walls uneven, its roof creaking whenever the wind pushed against it. Inside, the air was cold, heavy with the smell of damp wood, old smoke, and earth. The settlers stirred in this silence, waking not to comfort, but to the reality of another long day of survival. For the first American settlers, mornings began before the sun fully rose. The wilderness did not wait, and so neither could they. Men shifted from rough bedding made of straw, sometimes covered with furs if they were lucky, more often just thin blankets that held little warmth against the night's chill. Women rose more quietly, careful not to wake children still curled in nests of cloth, though the cold often stirred them before their mothers' hands did. Sleep was rarely deep. Every creak of the cabin, every call of animals outside, every gust of wind against the walls was heard in the shallow slumber of those who lived in a land that never truly felt safe. The first task of the morning was always the fire. Without fire, there was no warmth, no cooking, no light. The ashes from the night before were stirred carefully, hands brushing away the gray dust to find if any faint embers still glowed beneath. If so, they were coaxed gently with kindling, bits of bark and dried twigs gathered days before. If not, flint and steel struck together, the sharp ring of metal echoing in the cabin, sparks falling onto dry fibers until smoke rose and flame caught. This small moment carried immense weight. A flame meant life. The failure to spark one meant cold hands, empty pots, and a harder beginning that as the fire grew. Its warmth spread slowly, battling the chill that clung to the room. Shadows danced along the rough walls, and the smell of smoke filled the air again, a comfort despite its harshness. Women placed iron pots above the flames. Pouring in water fetched the day before, adding scraps of grain, perhaps a pinch of salt if it was available, maybe a piece of dried meat or root vegetables if the stores had not run too low. The smell was simple, earthy, but to hungry stomachs it promised strength for the day ahead. The men often stepped outside even before breakfast was ready. The air was crisp, damp with dew, the ground uneven beneath their heavy shoes. Beyond the cabin stretched the wilderness, forests thick with towering trees, branches tangled, ground covered with leaves and roots. The sound of birds stirred in the branches, mingled with the distant rush of a stream or the crack of wood settling. Each man looked out at this endless land, both opportunity and challenge. There were fields to clear, logs to cut, fences to raise, traps to set. The wilderness offered all they needed to survive, but only if they shaped it with their hands. Only if they worked until exhaustion pushed them back inside at night. Children woke slowly, drawn first by the light and then by the smell of food. They rubbed their eyes, their breath visible in the chill, their voices soft at first before turning to whispers and questions. Some clung to their mother's skirts, others stepped quickly to the fire, drawn to its warmth. Their mornings were quieter than their parents', yet even they were not free from labor. Water had to be fetched, wood gathered, small hands set to small tasks. For in this new world, no one was idle. Breakfast was plain, often little more than porridge or bread baked days earlier, hard but softened in hot broth. Yet it was eaten with purpose, for it was not flavor they sought, but strength. Men sat at rough wooden tables. Women served while taking small portions for themselves. Children ate hungrily, knowing there would be little more until evening. Words were few in these moments, for mouths were busy and minds already turned toward the work that lay ahead. The day's labor pressed into every bite, reminding them that food was never guaranteed, but earned through sweat and effort. The cabins themselves told their own story. Built by hand, with axes that bit slowly into trees, they were crude by modern eyes but precious to those who lived within them. Roofs were sealed with thatch or wooden shingles, walls caulked with clay, floors often just beaten earth. Windows were few, sometimes only covered holes, sometimes stretched with oiled cloth to let light through while keeping out the wind. Inside, furniture was sparse, a table, benches, chests for storage, straw bedding. Every piece had been shaped by the settlers themselves, carved from the very land they struggled to tame. Nothing was wasted, for nothing was easily gained as the morning grew brighter. The settlers prepared to leave the cabin for their day's work. Men took up axes, heavy and worn, their handles smoothed by calloused hands. Some carried muskets or simple tools for hunting, powder and shot carefully measured, for ammunition was precious. Women tied cloaks tighter around their shoulders, prepared baskets or pails, readied children for chores. The cabin emptied into the wilderness, its silence returning, broken only by the crackle of the fire left behind to keep embers alive. And yet, despite the hardship, there was also a rhythm in these mornings, a steady flow that gave structure to lives filled with uncertainty. Waking, tending the fire, eating the first meal, preparing for labor. These were not moments of luxury, but they were anchors. They gave shape to days that otherwise could have dissolved into endless toil. In the quiet of dawn, as breath hung in the cold air and light spread across the trees, each settler carried the weight of survival, but also the quiet strength that allowed them to rise again. Day after day, For the first American settlers, waking in the cabin was never just a moment of rising from sleep. It was the beginning of another test, another step in the long path of survival. Each morning reminded them of where they were, far from the familiar, surrounded by uncertainty, bound together by necessity. And yet, as the first light crept across the wilderness and into their cabins, they endured, not with ease, but with patience, with determination, with the quiet courage to face the day that waited beyond their doors. When the first settlers stepped into the forests of the New World, they found themselves surrounded by an endless ocean of trees. Tall oaks, straight pines, sprawling maples, and thick undergrowth stretched as far as the eye could see. For those who had left the crowded towns and fields of Europe, where land was scarce and boundaries clearly marked, the sight of such vast, untouched wilderness was at once breathtaking and overwhelming. Here, the earth was rich, but it was locked away beneath roots and trunks. To claim it, to feed themselves and their families, they would need to clear it, tree by tree, branch by branch, until small openings became fields, and fields became settlements. Clearing the land was not a task of days or weeks. It was the work of months, even years. Each morning, men took up axes whose iron heads were precious and whose wooden handles were already worn smooth from use. Their muscles, stiff from sleep on straw bedding, loosened as they swung, each strike echoing through the forest. The sound of iron biting wood was sharp and steady, a rhythm that carried across the clearing like a drumbeat of survival. Sweat quickly soaked through their rough linen shirts, even in the chill of morning. The effort was exhausting, but it was unavoidable. Without cleared land, there could be no crops. Without crops, there could be no survival. The trees themselves resisted. Some were so thick that a single trunk could take hours to bring down. Roots ran deep, tangled in the soil, forcing men to dig and hack before they could be pulled free. Branches fell heavily, cracking loudly as they struck the ground, scattering smaller growth in their path. Each tree seemed a small victory, each stump a reminder of how much work remained. The settlers marked progress not in acres, but in single trees cleared, each opening a step closer to the fields they needed. Children and women played their part as well. While men struck the trunks, others gathered fallen branches, stripped smaller limbs for kindling, and carried logs to be stacked for future fires. Women dragged brush into piles to be burned, the smoke rising in gray columns above the clearing. Children, too small to swing axes, gathered twigs and watched for sparks, their small tasks essential to the greater whole. Every hand was needed, for the forest seemed endless, and the settlers' time was always short. The work was not only exhausting but dangerous. Falling trees crushed anything in their path, and a moment's carelessness could cost a man his life. Splinters flew with every strike of the axe, sharp as needles, biting into skin. Tools broke, handles splintered, iron heads loosened. Blisters formed quickly on hands, raw and painful, yet there was no choice but to continue. A man might bandage his palms, grit his teeth, and return to his work, for to stop was to lose precious time. Winter would come, and the fields had to be ready before the first frost. The settlers learned quickly that clearing the land was more than physical labor. It was also a battle of endurance. The forest seemed to close in around them, each tree felled revealing dozens more, stretching into a horizon that never grew closer. Some felt the weight of despair, wondering if their work would ever be enough. Others drew strength from small victories, from the sight of sunlight finally reaching soil that had been shaded for centuries. Each open patch of earth, no matter how small, felt like hope carved from wilderness. Once trees were felled, the stumps remained, stubborn and unyielding. Some were dug out with shovels, the soil loosened around roots until they could be pried free. Others were left to rot slowly, fields planted around them until time weakened their hold. It was messy, uneven, far from the neat farms they had left behind in Europe. But the settlers had no luxury of perfection. Their fields grew where they could, between stumps and roots. Each row of planted seeds a compromise between what they wanted and what survival demanded. The wood gathered from this labor was never wasted. Logs became the walls of cabins, branches became fences, twigs became kindling for the fire that never truly went out. Large timbers were stacked for future barns or split into planks for floors and roofs. Even the ashes from burned brush were kept, sometimes spread across soil to enrich it. The settlers understood that in this new world, nothing could be discarded. Everything had value if it could help them endure. And yet, the forest was not only an enemy to be cut down, it was also a provider. The same trees that demanded sweat and effort also offered shade in the summer, warmth in the winter, and timber that shaped homes and tools. The settlers learned to respect the forest even as they fought to tame it. They marked trees that bore fruit, gathered berries from the undergrowth, hunted game that sheltered among the roots. The wilderness resisted them, but it also sustained them, a relationship of struggle and dependence that defined their days. Evenings after a day of clearing the land carried a special weight. Men returned to the cabins with shoulders aching, hands raw, bodies covered in dust and sweat. The smell of smoke from burned brush clung to their clothes, the sound of falling trees still ringing in their ears. They sat by the fire, eating simple meals in silence, their exhaustion deeper than words. Children fell asleep quickly, their small bodies tired from carrying wood or chasing embers. Women mended torn clothing, stirred pots, comforted little ones. The forest outside grew dark again, its silence returning as though it had never been disturbed. Yet in the morning, the axes would rise once more, and the settlers would return to the fight that in time, clearings grew. What began as a small patch of earth widened into fields, the soil turned by rough plows, seeds pressed into the ground. These first fields were uneven, dotted with stumps, but they represented survival. Each furrow was hope, each sprout a promise that the settlers' labor was not in vain. And when the first crops grew, when the first harvest was gathered, the memory of endless trees and aching muscles gave the food a taste richer than any banquet. Clearing the land was not a single chapter in their lives. It was a constant presence, shaping years of labor, marking the settlers' endurance. The forest always stood at the edge of their cabins, waiting, pressing close, reminding them that their hold on this new world was fragile. Yet with every tree felled, every stump dug out, every field planted, the settlers carved a place for themselves. They did not conquer the wilderness in a day, but they endured it, slowly, patiently, until what had once been endless forest began to open into the beginnings of home. For the first American settlers, food was not a comfort but a constant concern. Every meal was uncertain. Every day carried the question of whether the larder would be full enough to last until tomorrow, or whether hunger would tighten its grip. Unlike the homes they had left across the ocean, where markets bustled and fields had long been tilled by generations, here in the New World nothing was ready for them. The forests were thick, the soil untested, the animals wild, and the seasons harsh. To feed themselves, the settlers had to build an entire system of survival from the ground up, shaping meals not out of plenty but out of patience, creativity, and sheer endurance. At dawn, when the fire was coaxed to life, the first question was always, what could be placed in the pot? Bread was a staple, but flour was limited, carefully rationed from the barrels carried across the sea. Early settlers often baked coarse loaves from wheat or rye when they could, but more often their bread was made of whatever grains were available, sometimes mixed with ground roots to stretch it further. The loaves were dense, heavy, and hard, requiring soaking in broth to soften. Yet they were precious, and each bite carried the weight of survival. Porridge was common as well. Oats or cornmeal, boiled with water or milk if any could be spared, created a thick paste eaten morning and night. When meat or vegetables were available, small pieces were stirred in, giving the porridge a richer flavor. More often, though, it was plain, filling the stomach but offering little pleasure. Children grew up on these meals, their memories of food shaped not by feasts, but by bowls of steaming grain eaten by the glow of firelight. Meat was rarer. Hunting required time, skill, and ammunition, and settlers could not always spare any of the three. Still, men ventured into the forest with muskets or traps, seeking deer, wild fowl, or smaller game such as rabbits and squirrels. Each success was celebrated, the meat roasted or stewed, the bones boiled for broth, nothing wasted. Yet for every day of success, there were days of failure, when the forest seemed empty and hunters returned with empty hands. Fishing provided another source of food, streams and rivers offering trout, eels, and other catches. Nets were woven from cord, hooks fashioned from bone or metal, and hours were spent waiting by the water's edge. A single fish could stretch across a meal, its flesh divided carefully, its head boiled into thin soup. Vegetables and fruits were scarce at first. The settlers brought seeds from their homelands, but the soil of the New World was unfamiliar, the seasons unpredictable. Some crops withered quickly, others grew unevenly, leaving families uncertain of their future harvest. Over time, they learned to adapt, planting maize and beans, crops that grew more steadily in the new environment. Until then, however, they relied on what little they could gather. Wild berries were picked from the forest, though always cautiously, for some were bitter, others poisonous. Nuts were collected, their shells cracked open by stones, their kernels eaten fresh or stored for later. Roots and herbs were dug from the ground, boiled into stews to make them more digestible. Each discovery of edible plants brought a small sense of relief, for it meant one more day with food. Fire was at the heart of every meal. The settlers' fires never truly died, for relighting them was too great a risk. Embers were banked carefully under ash at night, coaxed to flame in the morning. Around the fire, meals were prepared in iron pots or on stones heated red by flame. The smoke clung to clothing, to hair, to the walls of cabins, a constant presence in daily life. And yet, fire was fragile. Rain could dampen kindling, winds could scatter sparks, accidents could destroy cabins built of wood and thatch. The settlers treated their fires with a mixture of reverence and fear, for without them, food could not be cooked, water could not be boiled, warmth could not be kept. Rationing became a daily ritual. Mothers cut loaves carefully, each slice measured so that it might last longer. Children were taught to eat slowly, to savor even small portions, to never waste a crumb. Men returning from the fields or forests were given larger shares, for their labor demanded more strength. Hunger was a companion at every table, pressing close, reminding each family that survival depended on restraint as much as on labor. There were moments of relief, moments when a harvest was gathered, when hunters returned with game, when nets came up heavy with fish. On these days, the settlers ate more freely, roasting meat over open flames, seasoning it with herbs, sharing portions that left stomachs full. These small feasts lifted spirits, giving hope that their work was not in vain. Yet, even in celebration, they remembered the need to save, to smoke meat for winter, to dry berries, to store grain. Every moment of plenty was shadowed by the memory of scarcity. Winters were the harshest test of all. Snow blanketed the ground, rivers froze, animals vanished from sight. Fields lay dormant, cabins grew colder, and food stores dwindled. Meals grew smaller, thinner, stretched with whatever could be found. Families boiled leather into broth, chewed on dried roots, survived on little more than hope and endurance. Hunger weakened bodies, slowed movements, made every task harder. Yet still they endured, their determination stronger than their emptiness. When spring came at last, The sight of fresh shoots pushing through the soil brought joy beyond words. The settlers' relationship with food was never simple. It was not only about nourishment, but about survival, discipline, and hope. Each bite of bread, each spoonful of porridge, each piece of meat carried with it the memory of labor, the swing of an axe, the turning of soil, the setting of traps, the waiting by rivers. Food was not taken for granted. It was earned, cherished, and remembered around the fire as families gathered with bowls in their hands. They shared more than meals. They shared strength, companionship, and determination. The firelight flickered on weary faces, children's eyes heavy with sleep, parents' hands rough with work. The food might have been plain, even meager, but in that moment, it was enough. Enough to carry them to the next day, enough to keep them alive in a land that tested them at every turn. And so, the settlers' days were shaped not by abundance, but by the constant struggle to eat. It was a struggle that demanded every ounce of labor, every spark of ingenuity, every thread of patience. Yet in this struggle, they found a way forward. Their meals, simple though they were, became the foundation upon which survival rested. Each fire that burned, each pot that steamed, each loaf that lasted another day was a small victory in the vast wilderness. And through these small victories, the first American settlers endured. For the first American settlers, survival in the New World began with shelter. Food and fire kept them alive, but it was the walls they raised around themselves that offered protection from rain, wind, and the biting cold of long winters. To us, a cabin may appear humble, for walls, a roof, and a door. Yet to the settlers, each cabin was a fortress carved from wilderness, the result of sweat, endurance, and endless labor. It was more than what stacked into place. It was safety, hope, and the very line between survival and despair. When the settlers first arrived, they had nothing more than temporary shelters. Some slept beneath makeshift tents made from sails stretched over poles. Others dug shallow pits in the earth, covering them with branches and brush. These shelters were crude, damp, and fragile, offering little comfort. Rain seeped in, wind howled through the cracks, and cold pressed against their bodies at night. Yet they endured because the real work, the building of proper cabins, could only begin once they had cleared enough land and gathered enough timber. The forest provided the material, but taking it required endless strength. Trees had to be felled with axes that rang through the air, each strike echoing in the silence of the wilderness. Logs were cut to length, bark stripped, ends notched so they could be stacked securely. The work was slow and exhausting. Men swung axes from dawn until dusk, their hands blistered, their shoulders aching, their bodies soaked with sweat. The sound of trees crashing to the earth became a rhythm of settlement, the first music of a land being shaped into home. Once the logs were ready, the real challenge began, raising the walls. Cabins were not built by one man alone. They required the strength of many hands. Families and neighbors came together, lifting heavy timbers, fitting them into place, securing them with pegs and clay. Voices called out instructions. Laughter mingled with the strain of effort, and slowly, a structure took shape where once only forest had stood. Each cabin was built in the same way, logs stacked horizontally, their ends locked by notches, gaps filled with mud, moss, or clay to keep out the wind. The roofs were covered with shingles split from wood or thatched with straw. Windows, when they existed, were small and few, sometimes covered with oiled cloth to let in light while keeping out the cold. Doors were rough, made from wide planks, hung on wooden hinges that creaked with every movement. Inside, the cabins were simple. The floors were often bare earth at first, later covered with planks if time and labor allowed. At the center stood a hearth, built of stone, where fire burned day and night. Around it the family gathered, eating meals, sharing stories, warming themselves against the chill. Furniture was sparse, carved by hand from timber. A table, benches, chests for storage, crude beds filled with straw. Every piece told the story of labor, shaped not for beauty but for necessity. Yet in their simplicity, these cabins held a quiet dignity. The cabins were small, often no larger than a single room where an entire family lived, worked, and slept. Privacy did not exist. Parents and children shared the same space, their lives unfolding together around the same fire. At night, the sounds of breathing, of whispers, of shifting and sleep filled the room. During storms, rain drummed on the roof, wind howled through cracks, smoke curled unevenly from the hearth. And yet, for all their flaws, these cabins were havens. Outside lay the vast, uncertain wilderness. Inside lay warmth, companionship, and the fragile sense of home. Building shelter was not only about individual families. It was also about community. Settlers helped one another, trading labor for labor, raising cabins side by side until small clusters of homes formed villages. In these villages, the sound of axes never stopped. Fires burned in every hearth, and laughter of children began to mingle with the creak of wagons and the calls of voices. Neighbors shared tools, shared food, shared stories. Alone, no family could endure the weight of the wilderness. Together, they built not just cabins, but communities bound by necessity and trust. Winter tested these shelters more than any storm of labor. Snow piled against the walls, winds cut through every small gap, and nights grew long and bitterly cold. Families huddled close to the fire, wrapped in cloaks and blankets, listening to the creak of timbers under the weight of ice. Every crack in the wall was stuffed with moss or clay, every draft blocked with cloth or wood. Still, the cold pressed in, and the fire was fed constantly to keep the room warm. Yet even in these hardships, there was comfort. The cabin held against the storm, its walls a shield, its hearth a heart that never stopped beating to eye in the evenings. When labor was done, the cabin became more than shelter. It was a place of gathering, where families ate their meager meals, told stories of the lands they had left, and whispered hopes for the future. Children played quietly on the floor, carving toys from scraps of wood, while parents spoke of the fields they would plant, the barns they would raise, the lives they hoped to build. These moments, humble and small, were what gave the settlers strength. The cabin was not only walls and a roof. It was memory and dream, the fragile balance between survival and belonging. Each new cabin raised was a victory, a sign that the settlers had claimed another corner of wilderness. As villages grew, the sight of smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of voices carried across clearings, became proof that they were not merely surviving, but building something lasting. The cabins stood as symbols of endurance, crude, small, imperfect, but unyielding against the vastness of the land that in the end, building shelter was more than an act of survival. It was the first step towards shaping a new world. Each cabin, raised with sweat and patience, stood as a quiet declaration that despite the wilderness, despite the cold, despite the hunger, these settlers would endure. And in their endurance, they built not only homes, but the foundation of communities, of futures, of histories that would stretch far beyond the walls they raised with their hands. For the first American settlers, life was never measured in hours of leisure, but in hours of labor. From the moment the first light of dawn crept into their cabins until the shadows of dusk stretched long across the clearings, every hand, young and old, was busy with work. Survival in this strange, untamed land depended not on dreams or promises, but on the steady rhythm of chores that consumed each day. If a family slowed, if they left tasks undone, the wilderness pressed back immediately, reminding them that their lives were balanced on the edge of constant effort. The morning began with the rekindling of the fire and the simple breakfast of bread or porridge. But even as the last spoon was lifted, The work of the day had already begun. Men shouldered axes, tools, or muskets, stepping out into the clearing to fell trees, to split logs, to turn soil that was often stubborn with roots and stones. Women gathered water from streams or wells, hauled buckets heavy in their arms, and set about grinding grain, stirring pots, or tending to children. Children, no matter their age, were given tasks suited to their size. Small hands carried wood, scattered feed for animals, fetched herbs, or watched over younger siblings. There was no separation between adult and child in the necessity of work. Only the smallest babies were spared. Farming consumed much of the settlers' time. The land, once cleared of its thick trees, was still raw and unyielding. Stumps dotted the fields, roots tangled beneath the soil, and every furrow turned by crude plows demanded double the effort of a field back in Europe. Men bent their backs to the plow, guiding oxen if they had them, or dragging the crude wooden blades themselves if no animals were available. Seeds were sown carefully, pressed into the soil with hope more than certainty. Corn, beans, pumpkins, crops learned from the wisdom of the land itself, grew more reliably than the wheat and rye of Europe. And slowly the settlers adapted their farming to match the soil of the New World. Beyond farming, the chores stretched endlessly. Fences had to be built and repaired, for without them, livestock wandered or predators attacked. Animals, cows, pigs, goats, chickens, if families were fortunate enough to have brought them, required feeding, watering, and care. Every drop of milk, every egg, every scrap of meat was precious, and so animals were guarded as carefully as family members. When sickness struck livestock, it was a blow that echoed through every meal for months. Woodcutting was another constant task. The forests that surrounded the cabins provided endless timber, but also demanded endless labor. Firewood had to be gathered in large stores to last through the winter. Logs had to be split into planks for cabins, barns, or wagons. Every swing of the axe, every creak of timber, was a reminder that shelter and warmth were carved from the wilderness one blow at a time. Smoke rose daily from the clearings, carrying the scent of cut wood, a signal to all that life here was maintained by steady toil. That women's work, though often quieter, was no less essential and no less exhausting. From morning to night, they prepared meals from whatever ingredients could be found, spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving cloth, sewing garments, repairing shoes. They tended gardens close to the cabins, where herbs, cabbages, and onions grew in small plots, providing both food and medicine. They washed clothes in cold water drawn from streams, scrubbing on wooden boards until their hands ached. They cared for children, comforted them when hunger gnawed, taught them small lessons while also ensuring they did not stray too far into the dangers of the woods. Women's labor often went unnoticed by outsiders, but within the community, it was the quiet foundation of survival. Children lived in a world where play was a rarity and work was the rule. They carried buckets of water, gathered berries, collected eggs, watched fires, frightened birds from crops. As they grew, they learned to handle tools. First small chores with knives or hoes, later heavier tasks with axes and plows. Their hands hardened early, their bodies strengthened by necessity, their childhoods brief but shaped by the rhythm of work that made them valuable to the family's survival. No task was ever truly complete. The settlers lived in a cycle where work repeated endlessly. Once a fence was mended, another broke. Once firewood was gathered, more was needed. Once crops were sown, weeds returned. Once cabins were sealed against the cold, storms tore at the roofs again. This endless repetition demanded patience, for frustration would not fill bellies, nor would despair keep fires burning. The settlers learned to endure the cycle, to see each day's chores not as burdens to be finished, but as rhythms to be followed. Evenings did not end the work entirely. After meals, tools had to be sharpened, harnesses repaired, clothing mended. Children were tucked into straw bedding while parents continued to prepare for the next day. Some men sat by firelight, carving handles for tools or patching holes in boots. Women spun thread long into the night, their fingers nimble even when tired. The glow of firelight on weary faces was the final image of each day. People who had labored from dawn until dusk, still working, still enduring. What made this life bearable was not the end of work, for it never ended, but the quiet strength found in community. Neighbors helped neighbors, trading labor for labor. One family might lend hands to raise a roof, another to harvest a field. Chores were shared when sickness struck, and no family was left entirely alone in its struggle. This shared endurance bound them together, forging communities stronger than any single cabin or farm. The settlers' days may seem harsh, filled only with toil, yet within them lay a deep resilience. They accepted the endless chores not as cruelty, but as necessity, the price of survival in a new world. Work was the heartbeat of their existence, steady and unyielding. And though their bodies ached, though their hands blistered, they rose each morning to begin again. For they understood a truth that carried them through. Survival was not found in single great acts, but in the patient, constant rhythm of work from dawn to dusk. Winter was the great test of the first American settlers. In the warmth of summer and the harvest of autumn, even in the exhausting labor of clearing forests and raising cabins, there was always a sense of progress. The land yielded food, the fields grew green, the air filled with the hum of life. But when the first snow fell, when the rivers froze and the days shortened into long nights, the settlers entered a season that stripped life to its hardest truths. Winter in the New World was not simply a change of weather. It was a struggle for survival, one that demanded every ounce of strength, patience, and endurance they possessed. The cold arrived slowly at first, creeping in on autumn winds. Frost glimmered on the ground at dawn, leaves turned gold and red before falling, and animals grew scarce as they retreated into burrows or migrated south. The settlers prepared as best they could, gathering wood into great piles, storing grain in barrels, salting or smoking what meat they could preserve. Women dried herbs and vegetables, packed roots into cellars, spun cloth for heavier garments. Men repaired roofs, sealed cracks in cabins with mud and moss, built shutters to block the wind. They worked with urgency, for they knew what was coming. And yet, no matter how hard they labored, winter always seemed to find its way inside. When the snow came in earnest, it covered everything. The fields lay silent beneath a white sheet, fences and cabins half buried in drifts, paths erased until only memory guided the way. The air itself felt heavy, sharp in the lungs, freezing fingers and toes within minutes. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys, the only sign of life in a world that seemed to have been swallowed by silence. Inside the cabins, families huddled around the hearth, feeding the fire with logs split months before, the flames their only defense against the biting cold. Food grew scarce quickly. The barrels that had seemed full in autumn now looked emptier with each passing week. Meals became smaller, thinner, stretched as far as possible. Bread was rationed, loaves cut into the thinnest slices. Soups were made watery, scraps of meat boiled until every bit of flavor was drawn out. Families learned to survive on less, chewing slowly, teaching children to eat with patience. Hunger gnawed constantly, a quiet ache that never truly left. Parents sometimes went without portions so that children could eat, disguising their sacrifice with soft words. Every crumb mattered. Every bite carried the weight of survival. Hunting in winter was harsh and often fruitless. Tracks were harder to follow in deep snow, animals scarcer and quicker to flee. Men who ventured into the forests faced frostbite, exhaustion, and the risk of becoming lost in storms. Yet they still tried, setting traps, following rivers, scanning for the faintest movement among trees. A rabbit caught, a bird snared, a deer brought down after hours of pursuit. Each was a victory, a small relief in a season of hunger. Fish were caught through holes cut into frozen rivers, lines lowered into the black water beneath. The cold numbed hands, but the sight of a fish pulled from the depths gave hope that another day could be endured. Clothing was never enough. Wool and furs were precious, but many families had little more than thin cloaks and patched garments. Feet wrapped in cloth and leather still froze in snow. Hands cracked and bled from cold, faces stung with windburn. Children cried from the chill, their parents wrapping them in whatever spare cloth could be found. At night, families slept close together on straw bedding, blankets piled over them, their shared warmth the only comfort. The fire burned low, embers glowing red, tended carefully through the night so it would not go out. Waking in the morning to a dead fire was one of the greatest fears, for starting it anew in the freezing cold was a desperate task. Illness thrived in winter. The cold weakened bodies, hunger thinned strength, and smoke from constant fires filled cabins with a haze that irritated lungs. Coughs spread easily, fevers rose, and remedies were few. Herbs gathered in summer were steeped into teas, honey used to soothe throats, roots boiled for their healing properties. But many illnesses had no cure, and families could do little but wait and hope. The loss of a child or parent was a sorrow felt not only within one cabin, but across entire communities. For every life was precious, every pair of hands vital to survival. And yet, amid this harshness, there was also resilience. Families found ways to endure together. Stories were told by the fire, tales of the old world, of ancestors, of adventures. Children carved toys from scraps of wood, played games with pebbles, sang songs to pass the long evenings. Women spun yarn by the hearth, their hands moving steadily even in the dim light, shaping thread for future clothing. Men whittled tools, repaired weapons, carved handles, or planned the next year's work. The rhythm of winter was slower, quieter, but it was not empty. It was filled with the hum of quiet labor, of families holding each other close, of determination that refused to break. The hardest nights came when storms raged outside. Winds screamed through the trees, snow battered against cabin walls, roofs creaked under the weight. Inside, fires blazed brighter, logs fed quickly, voices hushed in fear of the storm's strength. Families listened to the fury outside, comforted only by the walls they had built with their own hands. Each storm survived was a reminder of their endurance, of the strength found not in ease but in patience. When spring finally came, it arrived slowly. Snow melted into streams, the ground turned to mud, the first shoots of green pushed through the soil. Weak bodies stepped into sunlight, eyes blinking against its brightness, lungs filling with fresh air. The relief was immense, yet the memory of winter remained. The settlers knew it would come again, as sure as the seasons turned. And so, even in spring's warmth, they began preparing once more, gathering wood, planting crops, storing food, never forgetting the hunger and cold that had tested them so deeply. Winter was the season that revealed the truth of survival. It stripped life down to its essentials: food, fire, shelter, companionship. It tested patience, demanded sacrifice, and reminded settlers of their fragility. But it also showed their strength, their ability to endure, to adapt, to hold fast, even when everything seemed set against them. For the first American settlers, hard winters were not only trials to survive. They were lessons in endurance, shaping communities that learned to find hope even in the harshest silence of snow. For the first settlers in the New World, survival was never the task of one family alone. The wilderness was too vast, the winters too harsh, the labor too heavy for a single household to endure without help. Community was the quiet strength that carried them through. If a man's roof fell under snow, neighbors came with axes and arms to lift it again. If a child fell ill, Women from nearby cabins brought herbs, broth, and comfort. If the harvest was poor, food was shared, not because there was abundance, but because to let one family fail was to endanger them all. The bonds of community grew from necessity. Settlers who had once been strangers on the long sea voyage now found themselves bound as tightly as kin. The forests did not distinguish between one family or another. Danger threatened them all equally, and so they leaned on one another, trading labor for labor, sharing tools, lending strength. A man who helped raise his neighbor's cabin knew that the same hands would one day help him repair his own. A woman who offered food to a hungry child knew that her own children might one day be fed in return. These exchanges built a web of trust, a quiet assurance that though life was harsh, no one was entirely alone. Work was often done together. Fields were planted in groups, neighbors walking side by side, dropping seeds, turning soil. When harvest came, men and women gathered with sickles, filling baskets together, singing soft work songs that rose into the autumn air. Clearing land was faster with many axes swinging. Cabins rose higher with more arms lifting. Even the endless chore of gathering firewood became bearable when done in company. Laughter breaking through the monotony, voices carrying across the forest, the long winters, when cabins were buried in snow and hunger pressed close, tested the strength of these bonds most deeply. Neighbors visited one another despite the cold, trudging through drifts to bring small gifts, a handful of flour, a jar of dried beans, a piece of cloth. These offerings were rarely large, but they carried weight beyond measure. To receive help in hardship was not only to fill an empty bowl, but to feel the warmth of belonging, the knowledge that others cared whether you endured. In return, each family gave what little they could, a cycle of support that carried the community through the darkest months. Gatherings were rare but cherished. When weather allowed, families came together in clearings or larger cabins, sharing meals, telling stories, exchanging news of the land. These moments broke the isolation, lifting spirits with laughter, song, and conversation. Children played in groups, running across the open spaces, their laughter carrying like birdsong. Adults shared plans, advice, and quiet encouragement. In those hours, the settlers felt not only the weight of survival, but also the joy of companionship. Stories played a special role in strengthening community. Around fires, elders told tales of the old world, of villages left behind, of journeys across the sea, of hardships endured and overcome. Others shared stories of the land itself, of animals encountered, of near disasters turned to lessons. These stories bound the community together, giving meaning to their endurance, turning their struggle into a shared memory that would one day be passed to their children. Even in grief, community held firm. When sickness claimed a life, neighbors gathered, not in grand ceremonies, but in quiet solidarity. They helped dig graves, offered comfort to the bereaved, shared the silence of loss. In these moments, the settlers learned the depth of their bonds. For sorrow was carried together, just as labor and joy were. The strength of community lay not in abundance, but in the willingness to share scarcity. Each family knew that they could not control storms, nor hunger, nor the wildness of the land. What they could control was their care for one another, their decision to endure not as individuals, but as a group. This unity was as vital as food or fire, for it gave settlers the courage to rise each morning and face the wilderness again. And so, amid the endless work, the biting cold, and the uncertainty of each day, community became the settlers' truest shelter. Cabins gave warmth, fires gave light, but it was the presence of neighbors, the comfort of companionship, that gave life meaning. For in hardship, they discovered that their survival was not only in their hands, but in the hands of all who stood beside them. For the children of the first American settlers, life was never simple or easy. Unlike the generations that would follow, they had no time to dream of childhood as a season of play or learning alone. Instead, they grew up in cabins where cold crept through the walls, in fields where work never ended, in villages where every hand, large or small, was needed for survival. To be a child in the early settlements was to step early into the rhythms of adulthood, to carry burdens too heavy for young shoulders, and to find small joys in a world shaped by hardship. From the moment they could walk, children were given tasks. The youngest carried sticks to feed the fire, fetched water in small pails, gathered eggs from coops. As they grew, the work grew with them. Boys followed their fathers into the forest, learning to swing small axes, to split kindling, to trap rabbits or fish in streams. Girls stayed close to their mothers, stirring pots, mending cloth with clumsy stitches, watching infants while older siblings worked. Childhood was a season of apprenticeship, where every task learned was a step toward the full weight of responsibility that awaited them. Their days began with the same dawn as their parents. They woke on straw bedding, often huddled together for warmth, the sound of the fire being stirred their first call to rise. Breakfast was taken quickly, a bowl of porridge, a crust of bread softened in broth, before chores began. There was no long stretch of leisure. The sun was their clock, and each hour had its labor. In summer, children were sent into fields to scare birds from crops, their shouts and clapping hands echoing across the rows. In autumn, they carried baskets during harvest, small arms straining under weight, yet proud to be part of the gathering. In winter, they fetched wood from stacks, their faces red from cold, their arms trembling with effort. Schooling, as we think of it now, was rare. Books were precious and often scarce. Some children learned to read and write if their parents possessed the skill, tracing letters by firelight on slates or scraps of parchment. Others grew without letters, their education built instead from the lessons of survival. They learned how to plant and harvest, how to mend and build, how to recognize herbs for healing, how to endure hunger and cold. Their knowledge was practical, immediate, bound to the rhythm of daily life. Wisdom was measured not in words, but in the ability to survive another season. And yet, even within this harsh world, children found ways to play. They carved toys from scraps of wood, shaped dolls from cloth, rolled stones into games. They ran through clearings, their laughter carrying above the hum of work. They chased one another through cabins and fields, their joy brief but real. These moments of play were not wasted. They gave children strength, taught them agility, bound them to one another with bonds of friendship. Parents, weary from endless labor, sometimes paused to smile at their children's games, reminded that even in hardship, life carried lightness. The wilderness itself was both playground and teacher. Children climbed trees, explored streams, watched animals with wide eyes. They learned to move carefully, to recognize dangers, to respect the forest's silence. Many of their earliest memories were of nature: the smell of pine, the crackle of leaves beneath their feet, the sound of birds at dawn. This closeness to the land shaped them, made them resilient, gave them a familiarity with the wilderness that no classroom could provide. But dangers were never far. Illness struck children quickly, their bodies more fragile against the cold, their stomachs more vulnerable to hunger. Many did not survive the harsh winters, their absence a heavy sorrow in families already stretched thin. Accidents happened, too. Axes swung carelessly, fires flared unexpectedly, rivers claimed the unwary. Parents watched their children closely, yet could not protect them from every danger. Loss was a shadow that hovered over every family. And the laughter of children was precious partly because it was never guaranteed to last. For those who did survive, the hardships shaped them into strong and capable adults before their time. A boy of 12 might already wield an axe with practiced strength. A girl of the same age might run a household in her mother's absence. Their hands bore calluses, Their faces carried the seriousness of responsibility. Childhood as we know it, a season set apart, sheltered and free, barely existed for them. And yet, in their endurance, they became the backbone of the future settlements, carrying forward the skills and strength their parents had taught them. Evenings offered moments of closeness. After chores, children sat near the fire, listening as their parents told stories of the old world or whispered lessons of patience and endurance. They leaned against mother's skirts, drifted to sleep on father's laps, their dreams filled with images of fields, forests, and distant seas. These small moments of tenderness softened the edges of hardship, reminding families why they endured in the community. Children were not only members of households, but threads in the fabric of survival. They played with one another, worked together, learned side by side. Friendships formed in these years lasted lifetimes, forged in the shared memory of struggle. Children who chased each other in fields would one day clear land together, raise cabins together, and guard one another in adulthood. Their bonds were as much a part of the settlers' strength as the walls of their cabins or the crops in their fields. To grow up as a child among the first settlers was to know hunger, cold, and endless labor. But it was also to know resilience, companionship, and the quiet joys of small victories. Each day shaped them, preparing them not for ease, but for endurance. Their lives remind us that survival is not carried only by the hands of adults, but also by the laughter, labor, and courage of children who learn to grow strong in a harsh world. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest grew dark, life in the settlement did not stop, but it changed. Daytime was filled with the rhythm of axes striking wood, the creak of plows, the calls of children driving birds from fields. Nighttime carried a different weight. Darkness in the new world was heavy, almost absolute, broken only by the glow of fires and the pale light of the moon when clouds allowed it. For the settlers, night was a time of both rest and unease, a fragile pause in the constant struggle to survive. Inside the cabins, fires glowed in stone hearths, their flames licking at logs split during the day. The warmth spread unevenly, strongest near the fire, fading quickly toward the corners where shadows lingered. Families gathered close, sitting on benches or stools, children curled on the floor with blankets, parents mending clothes, sharpening tools, or simply watching the flames dance. The crackle of burning would fill the silence, a sound at once comforting and necessary. For without fire the cold pressed in mercilessly. Meals at night were modest, often no more than broth, bread, or porridge. Yet they were eaten together, the act of sharing giving strength beyond what the food alone provided. Parents spoke softly of the day's labor, of fences mended, fields plowed, animals tended. Children listened, their eyes heavy with sleep, their minds filled with the steady rhythm of survival. Sometimes, neighbors visited, bringing news, trading small goods, or simply offering company. Laughter might rise for a moment, cutting through the silence, reminding everyone that even in hardship, joy still existed. But beyond the fire's glow, the night carried unease. The forest pressed close, its sounds magnified by darkness. Branches creaked in the wind, owls called from trees, unseen creatures rustled in the undergrowth. Every snap of a twig, every distant howl, stirred the settlers' nerves. The wilderness was alive at night, and though cabins offered shelter, their thin walls could not block the fear that crept in with the dark. Parents listened carefully, ears tuned to sounds beyond the crackle of the fire. Alert for danger even as they tried to rest, to guard against the unknown. Settlers often left fires burning outside cabins as well, small beacons that pushed back the shadows. The flames lit narrow circles, enough to see the clearing but not far into the trees. Within those circles, the settlers felt a fragile safety, as though the fire's glow marked the boundary between themselves and the vastness of the wilderness. Children sometimes peeked through cracks in cabin walls, watching the flicker of those outdoor fires, imagining monsters hidden just beyond the light. Night also carried practical dangers. Sparks from fires could ignite dry thatch or wooden roofs, turning homes into flames within minutes. Families were always cautious, banking fires at night, keeping buckets of water close. Accidents were feared as much as the wilderness, for one misstep could destroy months of labor in a single hour. Fire, the settlers' greatest ally, was also their constant risk. Sleep came unevenly. Beds of straw and rough blankets offered little comfort, and the sounds of the night made deep rest difficult. Families often slept close together for warmth, their breaths mingling in the cold air, their bodies curled tightly. Parents stirred often, waking at the smallest sound, checking embers, tucking children closer. Dreams were shallow, colored by hunger, fatigue, and worry. And yet, even in such restless sleep, they found enough rest to rise again at dawn. There was also beauty in the nights. On clear evenings, the stars stretched endlessly overhead, brighter and closer than many settlers had ever seen in Europe, where cities and towns dimmed the skies. Here, the heavens seemed vast and untouched, a quiet canopy above the dark earth. Some settlers stepped outside their cabins in silence, gazing upward, feeling both small and strangely comforted. The stars were constant, steady, unchanging, even when everything around them felt uncertain. Children, though often afraid of the dark, also found wonder in the nights. They whispered stories by firelight, imagining creatures in the shadows, turning fear into games. They listened to the calls of owls, trying to mimic them, their laughter soft but bright. Parents allowed these moments, for they knew that even in hardship, children needed a touch of magic, something beyond the grind of survival. Nighttime stories, told in hushed voices, wove memory and imagination together, giving children dreams gentler than the world outside. In times of danger, when storms raged, when illness struck, when wolves howled too close to the settlement, the community leaned on one another. Neighbors gathered in single cabins, fires burning brighter, voices louder, as though unity itself could drive back fear. These nights were long, filled with unease, but they also revealed the quiet strength of people who refused to face darkness alone. For the settlers, nights were a mirror of their lives, fragile, uncertain, yet filled with endurance. Fires pushed back shadows, families drew close, communities stood together. Sleep was shallow, fear was constant, but so was strength. Each morning, when dawn finally returned, it felt like a victory, a reminder that they had survived another night in a world that tested them endlessly. And so, the rhythm of the settlers' nights shaped their endurance as much as their days. Fires, fears, and quiet strength carried them through, teaching them patience, binding them closer, reminding them that even in the deepest dark, there was always light waiting to rise again. For the first settlers, the sight of green shoots rising from soil was more than a promise of food. It was a promise of survival. After months of hunger, endless labor, and fear that their strength might fail, the first harvests were moments of triumph carved directly out of hardship. Every furrow in the field, every sprout that rose toward the sun, every kernel gathered into waiting hands was a victory. It was proof that their endurance had meaning, that the wilderness could be tamed, that the long nights and weary days had not been endured in vain. Planting began long before the harvest, of course, and even that act carried the weight of hope and desperation. Seeds brought across the sea were precious, counted carefully, pressed into the earth as though each one carried the fate of a family. Men guided crude plows through fields still dotted with stumps, their shoulders aching as they turned the soil. Women followed behind, dropping seeds into the furrows, covering them gently with earth. Children helped where they could, chasing birds from the rows, carrying small baskets, or pressing seeds into the ground with tiny fingers. Every hand was needed, for every seed mattered. The waiting was the hardest part. Weeks stretched into months as families watched their fields with anxious eyes. Too much rain, and the soil turned to mud, drowning fragile shoots. Too little, and the ground cracked, the plants withering before they could bear fruit. Insects devoured leaves, storms flattened crops, animals stole into fields at night. The settlers guarded their land as fiercely as they guarded their homes, chasing away crows, mending fences, praying silently with every sunrise that the plants would grow strong. Each morning, families stepped into the fields, hearts tight with worry, searching for signs of life among the rows. When at last the shoots grew tall and strong, a quiet joy filled the settlement. Stalks of corn reached toward the sky, beans climbed their poles, pumpkins swelled on the ground. Green spread across the once barren soil, and the sight lifted weary spirits. Children laughed as they ran between rows, their voices carrying like birdsong, while parents bent low to inspect the plants, nodding with satisfaction. It was not abundance yet, but it was life. The harvest itself was a season of both exhaustion and celebration. Families rose before dawn, carrying sickles, baskets, and sacks into the fields. Men cut stalks of grain, their arms moving in steady rhythm, while women and children gathered the bundles, stacking them into piles. Corn was pulled from its husks, beans stripped from their vines, pumpkins lifted carefully from the earth. Sweat ran freely, backs ached, hands blistered anew, but no one complained. Each basket filled was a victory. Each storehouse stocked a shield against hunger. The fields buzzed with voices, the sound of labor carried on the wind, the air filled with the scent of cut plants and turned soil. The first meal made from fresh harvest carried a taste beyond any feast. Bread baked from their own grain, corn roasted over open flames, stews thick with beans and pumpkins. These were foods that nourished not only the body but the spirit. Families gathered around tables, sharing portions with joy that bordered on reverence. Laughter filled the cabins, the weariness of months of hunger finally eased. For once, bowls were filled generously. Children ate until their stomachs were full, and parents looked at one another with the relief of people who knew they would endure another winter. Storing the harvest was as vital as gathering it. Grains were dried and packed into barrels, beans strung and hung from rafters, pumpkins and squash kept in cool corners to last through the cold months. Meat, when caught or hunted in autumn, was smoked or salted, added to the stores. Women worked tirelessly to preserve every scrap, knowing that careless waste could mean hunger when snow returned. Men built larger cellars, sealed against damp, their walls lined with baskets and barrels. The sight of full stores brought a deep satisfaction, a comfort that went beyond the moment. The harvest was also a communal event. Neighbors helped one another, moving from field to field, sharing tools, trading labor. One family might have stronger crops of beans, another more pumpkins, another larger fields of grain. Together, they shared and exchanged, ensuring that no one was left without. These exchanges built bonds of trust, weaving the community tighter, reminding each family that survival was shared. Evenings during harvest were alive with quiet celebration. After long days in the fields, families and neighbors sometimes gathered to share meals, to tell stories, to rest together. Fires burned brighter, songs rose into the air. Children played until the stars appeared. For a brief season, the settlement felt less like a place of struggle and more like a place of belonging. Hope hung in the air as tangibly as the smoke from fires or the scent of drying corn. The first harvests were never perfect. Fields were still uneven. Some crops failed. Some families stored less than they needed. But even in imperfection, the settlers found strength. The memory of their arrival, of empty cupboards, of hunger gnawing at their stomachs, of winters endured with little more than scraps, made every ear of corn, every sack of beans, every loaf of bread feel like treasure. They had carved food from the wilderness, turned uncertainty into sustenance, and proven that survival was possible. When the final rows were gathered and the fields lay bare once more, the settlers looked at their stores with pride. They knew the next winter would still be harsh, still filled with cold and hunger, still testing their endurance. But they also knew they had faced the land and drawn life from it. The first harvests gave them more than food. They gave them hope, the knowledge that with enough labor and patience, the wilderness could yield to human hands. For the first American settlers, the harvest was not just an agricultural act. It was a symbol of their perseverance, their courage, and their unbreakable will. In the rhythm of planting, waiting, gathering, and storing, they found not only survival but the beginnings of a future. And in that future, however uncertain, they saw a life beyond struggle, a life built slowly, season by season, on the stubborn hope that had carried them across the sea and into a new world. And so, when we look back at the lives of the first American settlers, we see not grand monuments or great battles, but the quiet rhythm of daily survival. Waking in cold cabins at dawn, clearing forests with weary hands, struggling to find food, raising walls against the wind, working from dawn to dusk, enduring winters, leaning on one another, raising children in hardship, gathering around fires at night, and finding hope in the first harvests. All of these small, ordinary moments became the foundation of something extraordinary. Their story is not about ease, but about endurance. It is about people who arrived in a land they did not yet understand and, through patience, labor, and resilience, carved a life from wilderness. They stumbled, they suffered, they feared, but they also endured, building communities that would last beyond their own lives. The cabins they raised, the fields they planted, the bonds they forged in hardship. These were the seeds of a future they could barely imagine. Perhaps that is the lesson their story leaves us, that history is not only written in great events, but in the quiet strength of people who refuse to give up. Their struggles remind us that survival often rests not on single moments of triumph, but on countless acts of persistence, repeated day after day. As you drift toward rest tonight, imagine the soft glow of a fire in a rough wooden cabin, the hush of the forest outside, the steady breathing of families who endured together. Let their quiet strength remind you that even in hardship, there is resilience, and even in struggle, there is hope. Thank you for listening. And if you found calm in these stories, remember to like and subscribe so that more of these quiet journeys through history can find you again. Until next time, sleep well.